Just a quick diversion. We organized our app a little differently this time, putting everything inside an object. So these were all methods, and we did it like this at first. Init, we know, is just a property of app that happens to be a function. And originally, that's how we wrote it, like this. But in ES6, we learned you can shorten this syntax like that. There's another thing you can do in ES6. There's a new class keyword. Now, JavaScript does not have classes like languages that you're used to. It is object-oriented, but it uses prototypal inheritance, not classical inheritance. The differences are not worth going into at the moment. Suffice to say, these are not real classes as you know them, but they use class-like syntax, so you can do that now, and it looks a little more like what you're used to. It still doesn't do inheritance and data hiding the same way as classes and actual class-based object-oriented programming languages, but it's a convenient way to write these things sometimes. So we could make app a class. Now, one thing about classes is you typically name them with a capital letter. So we could change this from const app to class app, and I would just make it a capital letter at that point. The language doesn't enforce that, but everyone does it, so do it. Then we don't need an equal sign. We just need the curly braces. And then you don't need commas between your methods. So we'll get rid of those commas. And one more thing. You don't just call methods on them like this. You need to instantiate them. You need to use the keyword new. So instead of saying app.init down here, we need to say new app, like that, something like that. And we could save it. We could save the instance to a variable so that we can still use it in the console. But if we didn't do that, then we wouldn't even have that global variable anymore. But what about init? All our good stuff's happening there. But if you're using a class, what's that called? What's the function that runs when you instantiate a class? Constructor. And yes, even though these aren't real classes, we do have constructors. So if I just rename init to constructor, you don't give it the same name as the class in JavaScript. You just name it constructor. And notice our syntax highlighting actually made a different color from all the other methods. So just name it constructor. And then what we can do is say new app and actually pass this little object of selectors in as an argument to it, because it's going to run our constructor. If we did this right, it should not work any differently. Everything still works fine. So all I did, change const to class, uppercase my variable name, get rid of the equal sign, get rid of all the commas between the methods, just 4 of them. And then use the constructor. Oh yeah, rename init to constructor. And then use the constructor to instantiate this thing. Yeah.
So I know in Java we can make multiple constructors. So there's empty, and then we can have ones with parameters.
Yeah, not in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, you can never have 2 methods with the same name. You can't do overloading of methods just by giving them different argument lists. If you need to achieve the same thing, what you have to do is actually look at the arguments that were passed in, determine which set it was, and then proceed accordingly. So,
but you did mention that it doesn't really count the number of parameters.
That's right. It's not going to enforce it. You have to enforce it. So you can basically do it that way. You can just look at that arguments object, see what types were passed in, and then figure out which implementation you want. So sometimes you'll see in the documentation, even on here, that a method might have more than one signature. Now, that doesn't mean there's actually 2 versions of that. It just means that the code inside that method is checking your arguments and determining how to go forward. Yeah, so you can achieve the same thing, but it's a little messier. Yeah. So one is down here. If I didn't need to mess with this thing in the console, I could just say new app, and then my instance would not even be in the global scope. I would just be instantiating the thing without even creating a single global variable, which might be nice. I don't have to remember to put the commas there, which is kind of nice if I'd been doing it this way from the beginning. And we're not going to do it in this case, but there are cases when being able to do inheritance, even though it's not necessarily the inheritance you're used to, but doing inheritance might be really useful. And say you were about to learn React. It might be handy if you had seen classes before. So that's the very specific reason we're doing it. But honestly, if I were writing this thing anyway, I would probably make it a class instead of just an object anyway. This is probably really how I would do it. But yeah, we are going to use classes in React, so it's nice to have already seen them. So I will just say use an ES6 class. It was ES6 that introduced these, aka ECMAScript 2015.